Is that good?
Yeah.
I'm going to read from my novel, Playing St. Barbara. The story centers around Claire Sweeney. She's a coal miner's wife and her 3 daughters in a Depression-era mining town in southwestern Pennsylvania. Every mining story, of course, has to have a disaster. And so the passage I'll read happens in the immediate aftermath of a cave-in. And unfortunately, it's a bit of a spoiler, but it does fit the theme of silver linings. Right now, all the townspeople are gathered at the mine yard waiting for word about what really happened. And Nora is the point of view character in this particular passage. She refers to her mother as Mutti, which is mama in German. Her father is Finbar, whom she calls Pap. He's an abusive alcoholic and a union activist. And in his prime, he was the star of the town baseball team. The bosses are Big Bill, Mr. Donovan, and Mr. Phelan. And Anton Zekula is Finbar's mining buddy. Nora and Mutti inched forward until Nora's fingers closed around the top of the mine gate. To the left stood Deputy Harrison, his club propped on a bulky padlock. A row of his grim-faced assistants blocked the way to the tipple. Outside the lamp house, cars and ambulances parked at odd angles. Yardmen, bosses, and a dozen dirty miners huddled around the head frame. White-coated medics hovered by a large gray tent. 4 men in business suits convened beside the mine office door. Big Bill was nowhere to be seen. Nora gripped the cold metal bar, ignoring the hips and elbows buffeting her back. St. Barbara's church bell chimed 7 o'clock, then 7:30, then 8, before a tall man left the group at the head frame and headed toward the crowd. Deputy Harrison raised his club. "Pipe down," he shouted. "Big Bill's coming." Big Bill stopped well behind the row of assistant deputies. 2 rescue teams are underground now, searching for, he coughed, covering what Nora sensed was a slip-up. He'd started to say bodies. "For survivors," he went on. 12 more men have come out. Their family members can see them as soon as the doctors allow. "Let me in," said a woman. "I can bandage as good as any doctor." In vain, Big Bill waved his arms, but the mob refused to quiet. "The cable's moving," someone cried. "The cage is coming back up." Big Bill ran to the head frame, now swarming with men. Mutti's head dropped onto the gate, sending a quiver through the metal. The shutter rose through Nora's fingers into her arms, her chest, her jaw. Every muscle thrummed as she peered through watering eyes at the grid that had closed the hoist cage. The crowd roared as the cage lurched to a stop. Inside, sooty men wore pale masks attached to oxygen tanks. Some stood upright, supporting others. A few clung to the bars of the cage. The medics hurried forward and with stretchers. Someone unlatched the door. Orderly as dominoes, the miners fell through it. After 12 had been carried off, a trio still huddled in the corner. Big Bill, who'd never broken stride, entered the cage and with the medics' help, carried out the remaining men. The blackened figures seemed indistinguishable to Nora, but she was shocked when Mutti lunged toward Deputy Harrison. "That's my husband," Mutti shouted. "Open the goddamn gate and let me in." Perhaps it was the surprise of hearing such language from polite Mrs. Sweeney that prompted the deputy to obey. Clubs raised, his assistant stepped forward. He stepped back and shook his head before opening the lock. Deferential as a bellhop, he motioned Mutti and Nora forward, then slammed the gate before anyone else could follow. Nora ran clumsily, hobbled by her shoeless foot. Mutti sprinted ahead, shouting at the medics to wait. Ignoring her, they carried Pap's stretcher into the first aid tent. Panting, Nora caught up with Mutti when Big Bill and Mr. Donovan blocked her way. "You can't go in yet," said Mr. Donovan. Brushing dust from his pinstripe lapel, Mr. Phelan said, "Calm down and listen, Claire. The blast triggered a roof fall in Finn's section. The rescue squad had to tunnel through a good 10 feet of rubble to get to him. Anton Zekula saved the day, beating on his bucket so they knew where to dig. Finn's in a bad way, poor devil. His leg got caught. You've always wanted him dead and the union with him, so don't let on you're bothered by his condition now, Muti snapped. If you really give a damn, go down in the cage yourself and rescue someone else. Nora could not have been more surprised if Muti had turned into a boss herself. Mr. Phelan looked as if he'd been kicked by a mule. Tight-lipped, he nodded at a medic who pointed at the tent. This way, missus. When the medic drew back the flap, Muti recoiled, backing into Nora. The stench of vomit and loose bowels wafted toward them. White-coated doctors and medics zigzagged from cot to cot like blood-stained ghosts. Somber Father Kovac moved more slowly, raising his right hand and tracing a cross in the air above each miner. In his long black cassock, he remembered nothing if not an angel of death. "Do you see him, missus?" asked the medic. "Over there," Nora pointed. "They're putting something on his leg." Nora tripped over an oxygen tank and bumped into a cot as she made her way across the tent. The cot's occupant, whose face was too dirty to recognize, screamed. Then another man screamed, and another, until it seemed the canvas walls strained to contain such a maelstrom of misery that they might split at the seams. Suffused with shame, Nora joined Muti at the foot of Pap's cot. Their escort knelt to help a pair of medics hold Pap down, while a doctor bound his left thigh to wooden splints. Rust-stained gauze covered Pap's forehead and right eye. "Go to hell, the lot of you," he shouted, revealing teeth and a tongue as black as his tattered clothes. "Stop this torture and just let me die." "Die then," Nora whispered. She glanced at Muti. Neither she nor the medic seemed to have heard. Nora closed her eyes and wished with all her strength, "Die and leave us in peace." Pap howled. Nora opened her eyes. Her gaze fell on the bloody window torn in his pants. A deep gash above his right knee oozed blood. Muti shrank against her. Nora's inside contracted around the sinful wish that she knew, despite so much blood and dirt and palpable pain, would not be granted. Muti's pale face appeared frozen. A single tear inched down her cheek. Anyone who saw her would behold a worried but grateful wife. Nora, however, watched the tears slow trail and knew that it escaped from a deep well of despair. Muti had insisted on entering the gate to confirm with her own eyes what she wouldn't let herself believe outside of it. Like Nora, she'd expected to see Finbar Sweeney's corpse. A second doctor appeared with a syringe. The medic struggled to restrain Pap for the injection. On the neighboring cot, Mr. Zekula pressed a swollen hand against his chest and began to cry. "God bless him, Claire. When the roof caved in, Finn pushed me out of the way. Ran quicker than a rabbit, just like the old days when he was stealing bases. He saved my life, no doubt about it. Anybody says a word against Finn, you send him to me, and for the love of Christ, Anton, quit your goddamn caterwauling. Me eyes were so full of dust I couldn't see what I was pushing. If I'd known 'twas you, I'd have saved me strength," Pap retorted. His left eye opened long enough to take in Muti and Nora. "Who the hell let you in here?" he said before a coughing fit overcame him. The first doctor secured the splints and wearily straightened up. "Give him oxygen," he instructed the medic. To Pap, he said, "Lie as still as you can if you want to keep your leg." He turned to Muti. "You can stay with him till they bring the stretcher." The medic hovered with the oxygen mask, but Pap knocked it to the ground. The medic finally retrieved the mask and lowered it onto Pap's face. Nora regarded his limp form, trying to remember how he'd looked when he had run like a rabbit around the ball field. Had he ever been happy? Had swinging a bat and hitting home runs given him whatever fleeting pleasure that she and her sisters and Muti could not? The canvas flaps parted to admit a stream of women. Huffing like a locomotive, Mrs. Zekula flapped her hanky as she approached. "A miracle, thanks be to God," she proclaimed, before bending to gently wipe her husband's dirty face. In ones and twos, the wives and mothers kept coming, filling the tent with soft weeping and murmured reassurances. As women and doctors and medics crisscrossed the makeshift ward, Muti still did not move. Stiff as a splint, she stood beside Nora, watching as Father Kovac blessed Pap. Medics brought a stretcher and carried him away. Not once did Muti attempt to lay so much as a finger on her broken, bandaged husband. Even after the tent flap dropped behind him, she remained motionless, staring at the empty cot, as if the world had shrunk to this one place, leaving her nowhere else to go. Thank you.